And I'm Mark Schmitt.
And together, we are back for another edition of Blogging Heads. How about that?
Good. All right. And those who've never seen this before, I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, former colleague of Jim's at the New America Foundation.
Right, and I'm a contributor at the Fox News Channel, and I guess still technically somewhere at the New America Foundation.
Yeah, me too.
And I run a blog called SeriousMedicineStrategy.org, which I'm sure I'll find a way to plug.
Okay, good. Yeah, I didn't look at that until after the last time we did Blogging Heads. I didn't look at your blog until after that.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you. Yeah. Anyway, so Mark, what's new?
Well, what's Newt? We should ask. I think I'm worried for you because I'm not worried for you. I'm excited for you because if Newt Gingrich, disappears, then you become the preeminent intellectual in the Republican Party. Not the preeminent, perhaps the only.
I knew there was a damning.
He's the only thing blocking. He's the only thing in your way.
Well, I mean, it is a shame. We're speaking on Wednesday, and something tells me that he won't be in the race a month from now. Right. And so, I mean, going back to the 70s, I mean, Newt Gingrich has been one of the few Republicans that I know. I mean, it's one thing to say he's an intellectual, and he isn't. He's got a PhD.
Well, actually, I want to. I mean, that's a word I don't use very much. I don't really like it, but it gets ascribed to him a lot. So there's sort of no choice but to do it. But I do want to. I do want to kind of talk a little bit about just how smart is he really, and how useful are these ideas, and so forth. I mean, let's set it in context. So the immediate context is that on Sunday. I mean, he's had basically a very stumbling start to his presidential campaign. On Sunday, he called the Ryan plan for Medicare a step too far and radical social engineering, said he didn't like radical social engineering from the left or the right, and the rest of the week he's been walking that back. And this morning on Fox he said, any Democrat who who quotes me in an ad it's falsehood because those things have been erased from the record, and it's really silly. And we found out yesterday that he had a revolving debt of $250,000 to $500,000 at Tiffany's. Another interesting fact about an interesting man, I guess.
Right, with an expensive wife.
Right. So that's just to set the guy. It could be for him. It could be for him. Maybe he has his own. He has his own piercing needs in places we don't see.
Right. All right. Look. Newt's infinite flaws are well on display right now. Let me just say, to make the case for him as I have known him since 1982. He's a smart guy. He's an intellectual, but more than just being an intellectual, there's plenty of people who can throw around big words and so on, and plenty of people even in politics who have PhDs. I think, Mark, don't you have a doctorate?
I do not.
Oh, you don't? I thought you did. Anyway, plenty of people who do. And yet what makes Gingrich unique to me is his understanding and appreciation of the transformative power of technology and how it changes the world, whether it's the first wave, according to Alvin Toffler, which is agriculture, the second wave, which is industry, or the third wave, which is information. That sense, it's a kind of almost Hegelian technological determinism that, frankly, most Americans and certainly most politicians just aren't interested in because it doesn't involve them. This entire town consists of people fighting over the Congressional Budget Office and their projections for 10 years or 50 years from now when they have no idea what will happen 10 or 50 years from now. Think back to when we were kids or think back to 100 years ago. Plenty of people could predict all sorts of things about the future, but nobody had any idea what was going to happen in terms of the microchip and the transistor and the atomic bomb.
Well, that's I always think about it. We try to project out Social Security 75 years into the future. Well, Social Security just turned 75. There's no way. It's just inconceivable that at the time it was created that anybody could imagine the kinds of growth and economic changes that would have taken place over the following 75 years.
And yet people in this town do it anyway.
Right.
And pretty much lose all interest in any other variable. Whether it's the left, which says, well, this is why we have to protect Social Security, the right, which says this is why we have to cut Social Security or Medicare or whatever it is. And this town consists of nothing but sort of macroeconomists or pseudo-macroeconomists of the most vaporous type who will sit there and have a seminar talking about the deficit in 2060 and how they're going to fix it by some policy tweak in 2011 when, again, any decade of human history was full of surprises that said, well, that certainly throws every confident prediction in a cocked hat. And so Gingrich always had that sense of, look, when things come along like the microchip, you remember he gave that speech in April of 1995 when he was at his absolute peak as Speaker and seemed to have Bill Clinton on the run, and he sort of held up a microchip and said, look, this is going to change everything. And he was 100% right, and he was one of the few to grasp that. And so it will be a shame if that thought of injecting something into the debate, into the political debate, into the national future conversation, other than just the usual slinging back and forth, we must cut Medicare, we must empower patients, we must have IPAB, or whatever all these foolish bureaucratic programs are. I hope somebody else picks up that torch. And I don't mean me. I mean some elected official who's smart enough to see that we've been riding an escalator of technological growth that has meant that the U.S. standard of living has basically doubled every 30 years since America's existence. And we've been, that's really that's been much more dispositive as to our future than what Washington D.C. did yesterday. And one person who epitomized this, and it's a tradition that I hope in your current job you can help provide, was Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt didn't just depend on tax rates and spending and whatever. He was thinking, gee, if we build the TVA, if we build the Manhattan Project, if we fund aviation, if we fund electronics, we'll have a different America. And of course, he was right.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I think that's kind of the best way to make a case for Gingrich. Although my feeling about him has always been, there's that act of holding up the microprocessor or whatever. I mean, the classic one to me when he was first at the peak of his power was, they were trying to do significant cuts to a lot of programs like education, including education and so forth. And then he suddenly declares, give a laptop to every child, which, this was 15 years ago when laptops actually cost $3,000 or something like that. So, the actual giving a laptop to every child would probably be, close to half of the federal education budget that he was at the same time trying to cut. So I've always felt that those big ideas from left field were not necessarily, they weren't comparable to the TVA, which was a major action in keeping with a lot of other things that FDR was doing. They're kind of like out of left field distractions from the debate that seem in it that yes, they're different from what everybody else is talking about, and that's sort of part of their appeal. They're a kind of change the topic at the same time that what we're actually doing is the same old grinded out budget cutting politics.
Well, I mean, you're right in the sense that big ideas and big thoughts tend to get crowded out by the immediate politics, which is why, again, a president such as Franklin Roosevelt, can sit there in relative secrecy and just write a letter, get a letter from Einstein and say, yeah, he's got a point there about atomic power. That was back in 1939. Let's do it. And they get billions out of the Congress, and it just sort of happens, and basically in secret. It is more fun to be president than Speaker of the House, and Gingrich did. I mean, his book, Window of Opportunity, from 1984, when he was just a third-term member of Congress and not in the leadership at all, is full of things I can remember, people laugh at them, but I think they're kind of interesting ideas, like, using reflecting panels from space to beam solar energy, concentrate and then beam solar energy down to the Earth. That doesn't lack for ambition, if nothing else. I mean,
No, but I mean, these are sort of, it's good to be reminded that there are a lot of things out there, and certain, if you, a radical transformation of battery technology, for example, would completely change our lives. That's true. I understand that. He seemed to have a tendency to just kind of throw these things around. I mean, they're tough they're tough technological questions. Some things are really worth a big investment. Some things maybe aren't. You can, I guess somebody who's interested in those things is better than somebody who has no awareness of them at all. But I never really saw them actualized. I mean, there were two pieces in National Review yesterday, and I thought both of them were totally fascinating, by Rich Lowry and Jonah Goldberg. And I guess Jonah was quoting a Wall Street Journal editorial, which I didn't read, but that made the point that Gingrich kind of in practice, he combines this, incredibly vicious, overreaching language about, Obama being some sort of Kenyan anti-colonialist of a type that we Americans can't even understand, with actually a very cautious and poll-tested approach to policy, which is to say, I don't want to push this hard on Medicare. And in a way it seems to me there are three modes of Republican conservatives. There are three things you can do. One is the kind of say, we got to cut spending, we got to shrink government, and never quite do anything about it, which is what I think, left to his own devices, John Boehner would do. The second is to go right into the lion's den the way Paul Ryan has done, and the way Gingrich started off doing in '95 and then kind of fell back. And the third is to just come out of left field with some crazy nonsense about waving around the microprocessor or something like that, to sort of changing the discussion. And that seems to me that Gingrich's crazy ideas are very much in keeping with that idea of being at once vicious and cautious that that Rich Lowry and Jonah Goldberg talked about.
Well, let's take those three, because I agree with two of your three distinctions. First, there's an instinctive natural managerial republicanism, just like there's sort of a managerial democratism, if that's a word. Just it's what politicians do, right? They're not there to make waves. They got elected. They want to stay in power. Second, there's a libertarian strain in the Republican Party. Bryan comes to mind. And that third one, let's just take this third one about the crazy left field stuff. Gingrich gave a speech, which I noted in National Review in the middle of all the other stuff, and I'm sure my piece was completely buried under the heat of the moment.
Well, I read it.
Okay, well, there you go, because I sent it to you. That's why.
All right, I confess. But that's three pieces from National Review. Reading three pieces in National Review in one day is pretty good for me.
That's pretty good. So your ecumenical credentials.
And I liked all of them. I enjoyed all of them.
Fair enough. Well, the point I was making, it was just saying that Gingrich gave a speech to the Alzheimer's Association on, I guess it was Monday morning now, where he said, look, Alzheimer's is costing a fortune. It's I think the number he used was $182 billion a year now in expenses for Alzheimer's. It's headed toward a total of $20 trillion by 2050, and if we could make even minor progress on Alzheimer's, we could cut that in half. Now, that is your choice. That is either a crazy idea. I won't say it that way. You don't think it's a crazy. You think it's a good idea. But to me, the fact that the Beltway does view it as a crazy idea, well, that has nothing to do with the debate. What we want to have as a debate is right now about whether Obama is a socialist or whether the Republicans are heartless, Scrooges. And anybody who says, gee, you don't really need to think in either of those categories if you allow and then, frankly, encourage and enhance technological development. I mean, that's the point. The technology thing kind of spoils the fun of the fight for both sides. If we look, it'd be easy to say we're going to cut Medicare by 2/3, as Ryan proposed to do in his Ryan budget plan of a month or so ago. If we were curing diseases, if people didn't have Alzheimer's and they could continue to work till say 70, as opposed to 65, and healthily so, there'd be no entitlement crisis. And yet that vein of discussion, because of reasons that that C.P. Snow talked about almost more than 50 years ago now in his essay The Two Cultures, the political literary culture just isn't interested in hearing about there might be a scientific solution that would obviate the cuts. I mean, take an example. Suppose everybody's talking about the Ryan plan, and again, the Democrats are playing the same game too, because they both worship in their own way at the altar of the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. If somebody had said in 1970, looking ahead 40 years, we're spending too much on telephones. Mm-hmm. The way everybody says in 2011, we're spending too much on Medicare. And somebody said in 1970, well, Ma Bell is a ripoff, and the nascent computer industry led by IBM and Sperry Rand and Burroughs and whoever else was making computers 40 years ago. We're spending too much, so we'll have a 2/3 cut. looking forward 40 years. And the Republicans would say that, and the Democrats would say, well, that's too cruel. Let's only make it, instead of a 2/3 cut, let's make it a 1/3 cut. And Pete Peterson say, well, let's split the difference between 1/3 and 2/3, whatever that is.
Right.
And if we'd done that, there'd be no computer industry, there'd be no telephone. We'd be fighting. You and I, Mark, would be fighting over which one of us would get the rationed out black rotary phone with a cord. And of course, things like blogging heads and everything else that the internet has brought would never have existed at all.
Right. I was thinking,
go ahead.
One experience that young, people in their 20s don't have the experience that you and I probably had, when you lived with lots of roommates, negotiating out the phone bill every month. They don't know what that's like.
or waiting in line.
It led to huge amounts of conflict.
Right, waiting in line at a payphone. Hey, hurry up.
Yeah.
I'm talking to my girlfriend. Get lost. No, I gotta call. Something. No, there's a world of scarcity there that was completely demolished in a fairly non-confrontational, non-political way. I mean, obviously there's been fights over telco policy and so on for 40 years, but those fights, I think you'd agree, are nothing compared to the fights we had over abortion or Vietnam or Iraq or Social Security or Medicare or something like that. I mean, they've been relatively technocratic and relatively sort of smooth, and we now take it as a matter of course that a phone call is 99.999% cheaper than it was 40 years ago. Phones are probably 10 times more phones per capita than there were 40 years ago, and the phones we'd have are each one of them 100 times better.
Right.
And that is something that Gingrich and a few others, have made room for in their thinking as everybody else immediately falls into line saying, right versus left, my take on the CBO score versus your take on the CBO score.
Well, I would love, look, I mean, I know some people on the left who say, I mean, I understand, tiny variables in immigration, in technology can make huge differences in that CBO score. And I think that's great to appreciate that and not be this prisoner of those long-term projections. So I think that's kind of right. But, you sent me that article, and I clicked through to see, I was just curious to see the actual text of Gingrich's speech, and I saw, some of it on the Alzheimer's Association website. And it's kind of like, here's a group, and it's an important group, and they're here in Washington to advocate for more funding for Alzheimer's research. And most of the people who support, a lot of Democrats are very supportive of what they're doing. Gingrich comes in and poses something that's a very straightforward, should the NIH invest more in Alzheimer's research, which I think is because, I think the answer is yes, not just because we care about Alzheimer's, but because a set of things have happened that make it possible to see something as potentially curable that maybe even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we probably didn't see that as curable. Just because, genetics has moved in a certain way. So Gingrich makes this speech, and it's the same kind of thing. He's declares this grotesquely underfunded and, declares it as a kind of Manhattan project, when in fact it's a pretty straightforward, can we invest more in NIH funding for Alzheimer's? Maybe there are other research projects that maybe are less promising or whatever that could be redirected, or we just put more money into NIH, period. It's a pretty straightforward question about domestic discretionary spending, which in Gingrich's world, along with Ryan's world and everything else, domestic discretionary spending almost goes away. So maybe I'm a prisoner of the CBO, but if you don't have room for domestic discretionary spending, you're not going to do the crazy man on the moon investment in curing Alzheimer's.
I don't agree with that. I think that, first of all, I wrote that piece before his Alzheimer's Association speech.
Right. I know. I was just curious what the speech actually said. I'm not attacking your piece.
Right. No, I linked to his speech to the Brookings Institution on April 22nd, where he said we should have Alzheimer's bonds, which is a completely, again, a category of money, of capital, that doesn't fall into the CBO ambit because it's basically private, and we should be funding it that way. I mean, there's a million things to do in the world, and why should it be Alzheimer's bonds? Why not have infrastructure bonds? Why not have cancer bonds? Why not? I mean, I don't understand what's so brilliant about saying let's have Alzheimer's bonds. Let's invest in curing Alzheimer's. We can agree on two things. One is medical sickness is a problem. Okay, that's an apple pie statement. Second of all, Alzheimer's in particular is a grave threat to the existing fisc on Medicare spending, right? And third, the pharmaceutical medical research sector is grossly underfunded relative to the challenge ahead. As Elliot Janeway, famous Keynesian economist from the last century, said, when you're fighting a war and you're keeping track of all your money, you're not fighting the war hard enough. We need a lot more capitalists, and these are things Gingrich, I've talked to him personally about this over the years. You also need a real change in the way the trial lawyers operate, and you need a real change in the way the FDA operates. Which all of those points, if they weren't made in the speeches, and I confess I can't remember to what extent they were made, but I'm sure they were, and he certainly made them forcefully in the past. Giving money to the NIH is not particularly a good idea, because the NIH is not really, in a strange way, in the business of actually working on cures. They're in the business of research. And they've sort of gotten themselves into funding what a friend of mine calls curiosity studies, as opposed to running the way, say, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, runs, which says, look, we need this thing, we need it tomorrow, and we're going to contract it out until we get it. That's how you get the internet and the cruise missile and the next generation radar and stealth technology and so on. You don't really get it by giving to medical scientists and say, send us your grant and whatever you feel like doing, we'll fund. So I'm not really sure the NIH is a particularly good vehicle for this, although I don't oppose the NIH. I just say they've proven their limitations. When they say after spending $30 billion a year, over the last decade, and then they say, now we got a brand new program, which they just announced in the last year or so, called translational research, where of our $30 billion a year, we're going to spend $1 billion, 3% of their budget on actually turning medical research into cures. It's like a lot of bureaucracies left to their own devices. They don't really do much of anything except sort of fund their own friends.
Well,
and it'll take somebody to shake that up.
Okay, I don't know that much about the inner workings of the NIH. I know they have, large sector. It's certainly possible. Obviously, a lot of what Arlen Specter did was put money into research on cures, particularly for cancer and particularly for the several kinds that he had survived. And so obviously there are sections of they're not doing absolutely pure research unrelated to diseases. I mean, they're kind of organized around diseases. Basically, that I don't know that they're not looking for what the cure is. I mean, once you get to a certain point, presumably, if there's anything there, you reach a certain point that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't necessarily want to invest in, but at a certain point, maybe you're close enough that they take it the last mile. I don't know, but it doesn't seem to me that. I mean, what would you, if you did Alzheimer's bonds, let's say, and a large pool of money was put together? Essentially, you have some sort of what's different about the operation that would one of many things I would do is an X Prize. And a funded the X Prize for the Alzheimer's treatment would be funded in large part by future Medicare payments. In other words, if you cut our Medicare budget in half by eliminating Alzheimer's. Look, again, Alzheimer's is distinct from getting older. We all get older and fall apart. That's a given. Right. But some people get Alzheimer's in their 40s. Right, I understand.
One of my heroes in politics, Carroll Campbell, the former governor of South Carolina, died of Alzheimer's at, I think, 65.
Yeah.
And he was crippled from it 2 or 3 years before that. There was a guy who could have been easily vice president or president, and instead was dead at a relatively young age of Alzheimer's. So it's a disease. It's a disease. It's a distinct disease, and it afflicts about 5.8 million people, and scheduled to quadruple as with boomers and so on over the next 40 years. And it's an epidemic, just the way malaria was an epidemic, or smallpox was an epidemic, or whooping cough, or scarlet fever, or polio. And we've just gotten ourselves in a mode as a matter of Washington policy. Well, we don't cure diseases, we finance diseases. I mean, I truly think that our healthcare system now has been designed by nursing homes to maximize the number of people who are completely, unable to care for themselves, and so go into the Medicare, the Medicaid system for $1,000 or $2,000 a week for the rest of their lives, and that's and I'm sure they've got lobbyists and interest groups and stakeholders and so on. And so,
Right.
in the end, that's what we lack, though, Mark, is a president of either party who says that we're going to create a medical security council, and every day, just like we have a national security council meeting, we have a meeting to see where we are on Alzheimer's and whether the X Prize is a good idea or a Manhattan Project is a good idea or something else altogether. And a president who would then say, listen, this is a worldwide problem. America's kind of looking for ways to exercise soft power around the world, and we're tired of bombing people and cruise missiling them all the time is our only tactic. What if we called the president of China and said, look, China's got 400 million people scheduled to turn 60 or more, like in the next 30 years, 400 million. Now, what are you going to do with them? They're going to get Alzheimer's too, unless we all work together to do something about it. Anyway, no president, I emphasize no president, has come close to that kind of effort since maybe Richard Nixon or before him Franklin Roosevelt. And it shows in the dearth of new drugs and new medical devices. The number of new drugs approved by the FDA has fallen by 63% in the last 15 years. The number of new medical devices has fallen 55% in the last decade. The number of new antibiotics is down 80%. I mean, the proof is in the pudding that we have been strangling the medical equipment, drugs, cures pipeline, and leaving us only with the option of paying for the wreckage after the damage is done.
Okay, I mean, I guess I understand the point that Medicare and Medicaid put together, which is how we pay for a lot of nursing home care, isn't obviously that's not a research pipeline. It's not a cure production pipeline. That's a matter of caring for people. I mean, one of the things here is Alzheimer's is a great distinct example of where the technological breakthrough, if it happens, and I don't know, I don't know if an X Prize, I'm not sure that there's a great example of the X Prize, causing something to happen that wouldn't happen otherwise, because if the idea that you would drop everything and pursue something that if you're a scientific researcher, pursue something that still seems like an incredible long shot because of the possibility of this prize, that I'm not sure that would really change things. It might work if it was really sort of in the offing. I don't know, but the thing about it is that while that's one where the technological breakthrough would definitely reduce a lot of spending and a lot of human misery and be an incredibly valuable thing. There are a lot of other areas where the technological breakthroughs actually significantly increase costs. I mean, a lot of, transplants are a large cost that you never had, that you never had in the past. And just keeping people alive longer without Alzheimer's, if they work longer, that's great. Assuming there's an economy
Mark,
that,
How does the CBO score death? If you die, and if I die tomorrow, I don't want to be morbid about you. Let's say I killed over tomorrow. Would the CBO score in any way the income that I would have generated over the next, hopefully, 20 or 30 years of my life? The answer is no.
Well, I mean, they're not scoring at the individual
the heart
basis.
Transplant I might get is cheap compared to the money, not to be immodest, the money that I would generate, including the tax revenue. CBO doesn't score it.
Well, I mean, they're making estimates. I mean, when they're looking at the replacement rate for Social Security and Medicare and things like that, the ratio of workers to retirees is certainly something.
But they're not comparing the cost of my heart transplant to my future. Right. Now, again,
no. But if you retire at 66 and have a heart transplant the next year, and you work for 2 more years, and then you're retired for 20 years, that heart transplant is a cost.
Okay.
Not made up for the extra 2 years of work.
It is also an industry. It is also a job creator. It's also, I mean,
I'm not against the heart transplant. I'm just saying that I'm objectively pro heart transplant. I'm just saying not everything is going to be a net save. It's going to be a win-win. Right. And I think coming back to Gingrich wants to come in with things that he can portray as these grand win-wins. Yes, they're disruptive to the normal sort of CBO framed way that people in Washington think, but it's also a little bit of, people are always talking about everything as a win-win. It's a little unrealistic.
Well, I think technology is the win-win. I mean, look at the life expectancy in America in 1800 was 35. In 1900 it was 48. Now it's 78. And the GDP of this country in real terms is up, 50 times or something in that period of time. I mean, a healthy look. Even if you allow for the stereotypical 99-year-old who wants a pacemaker and so on, which I admit is in strictly economic terms not a wise investment. Although the lady, the old person in question might like it, and the family and so on, they might even pay for it. You pretty closely correlate long life and health and greater economic output. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the world, economics, healthcare is what economists, this is what called superior good. As you grow more affluent, you want more of it, and you can afford it. And not only do we want more of it and can't afford it, but so does the rest of the world. And then it gets cheaper. Everything that technology touches, also, if mass production is allowed to occur, it gets cheaper. I mean, that's how we're going to save money, not just on healthcare, but on everything else. Mm-hmm. Is by automating it, by applying, replacing, labor with technological inputs. That's the story of the last 3 centuries of the Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Makes it cheaper.
Right. So just to go back to Gingrich for a second, if you're sitting there having this conversation with Gingrich, do you really feel like this is a smart guy who I can learn a lot from, or do you feel like he's somebody who's sort of absorbed a few ideas and is bouncing them around in an incredibly undisciplined way? I
think he's a smart guy you could learn a lot from. I really do. I think he's also undisciplined and may well have talked himself out of the presidency, or at least the Republican nomination, which. Again, it's like Gary Hart. Gary Hart would say, "Don't judge me on my personal life, judge me on my ideas." Well, that doesn't really work that way. You've got, Aristotle said that persuasion consists of the ethical, the moral, the ethical, the logical, and the personal. So you don't really have that option to kind of, you can't say, "Look, I'm not going to answer questions about the Tiffany stuff because, it has nothing to do with my vision for America." Well, it has plenty to do with America's vision of him. Right. But I think that, again, it would be nice to see one politician who would, other than Gingrich, who would get up and say, look, we could cut Medicare by 2/3 if we unleash the same productivity increases, or half the productivity increases that we've seen in Silicon Valley over the same last period of time. And in the end, all medical issues will be subsumed by the internet, just as everything else has been subsumed by the internet. We'll live in a world of information where the thing that's most valuable about you or me in terms of our health care is, does a doctor have 100% total knowledge of our medical history? And is there a constant feedback process of every aging, middle-aged male, and everybody else too, that then says, look, what you really need is this, but not that. And there's an enormous amount of effort on what they call sort of the fourth paradigm of medical research, which is sort of skipping clinical trials and just going into data crunching, which has got a colossal promise, unless the FDA or the trial lawyers screwed up, in which case it won't happen.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm for that. I'm not against that.
Okay.
But I'm not.
Okay, very good.
I'm not. So, all right. So we can agree on that.
All right, we can agree on that. So what else you got?
Well, I was interested in the news today that Senator Coburn had dropped out of the Gang of Six. That seemed like there was some possibility of some kind of budget agreement from three Democrats, 3 Republicans in the Senate. Mm-hmm. But Coburn stepping away from it makes that a lot less unlikely. Part of it was Coburn
less likely
to happen, less likely for there to be some sort of agreement. And there was a little reading between the lines that needed to happen there, as the report said something like Coburn kind of came to the table with some new ideas, and it seemed like he wasn't negotiating in good faith. And I had understood that Coburn was one of the few Republicans, I guess Saxby Chambliss to some extent as well, who were willing to talk about tax expenditures, not tax rate increases or anything like that, but at least talk about expenditures through the tax code as part of a budget deal. And it sounded like ultimately he was maybe reined in on that because the party isn't willing to talk about that. If you're not willing to talk about that, you don't. It's really impossible to reach any kind of budget deal that doesn't include at least a discussion of tax expenditures.
Well, I'm delighted that Coburn walked away. I think that he would have gotten snookered. It's funny, I was not as an active major part of it, but I was in the White House under two different Republican presidents raising taxes. I was in the Reagan White House in '82, right. And then the Bush White House, Bush 41 White House in 1990.
Right. And Andrews Air Force Base.
Sorry?
Andrews
Air Force, right? The Andrews Air, the breaking the Read My Lips pledge and stuff like that. And in both cases, spending went up, not down afterwards. I think this was a guaranteed, as a matter of pure game theory and political science. Coburn and Chambliss and Senator Crapo of Idaho were guaranteed to get snookered. And they let themselves, because back to this CBO-olatry, this CBO mesmerism that goes on in this town, they like David Stockman before them, they spent so much time staring into the deficit and staring into the budget. That's the only variable they could think of. There's a big country out there, there's a lot going on, other than the federal deficit. And for them to say, well, gee whiz, we'll open the door to a tax increase, but they would say tax expenditures. I'm sure that I'm just a little story, because I do remember this really, really well. Back in 1990, 1988, Bush 41 had been elected president, saying, "Read my lips, no taxes." Okay. In '89, nothing happens on the budget. Bush 41 now proposed a capital gains tax cut that the Democrats just ignored. And then in 1990, the late Dick Darman, then OMB director, and then Chief of Staff John Sununu kind of worked out an idea where they said, well, we'll open up negotiations on a tax revenue increase. That was the phrase they used, tax revenue increase. And amazingly enough, they didn't do it. They thumbtacked a statement to the wall of the White House press room. They didn't say it on TV. They didn't say it anywhere. They sort of just posted it one time. Here, look at this, tax revenue increase. And Sununu told me at the time, this is so clever, because what the Democrats don't understand is when I say tax revenue increases, I mean cutting the capital gains tax rate. So you get it. We'll cut capital gains, revenues will go up, and we'll get the money, and the Democrats.
But which is always just a short-term boost, because people realize gains that they've been sitting on, and then it levels off.
Or they figure out a way to funnel it from regular income into capital gains.
Right.
Which has been the whole scam of all this hedge fund stuff for the last few decades and so on. And the Democrats said, well, gee, the Democrats were not stupid. They said, it is good to know that the president has broken his tax pledge, because, of course, the fiscal requirements of the country necessitate it. But we're certainly not going to entertain the idea that cutting the capital gains tax rate is the way to do it. We want President Bush and Darman and Sununu to say that they'll raise income tax rates. And that so follows 6 months of fighting where the Republican Party was completely demoralized because Bush had broken his promise. The Democratic Party was completely energized because they felt they were clobbering Bush. And in the end, we got a budget deal that was a tax increase and a spending increase, and we got a recession. So I mean, it was of course President Bush lost his re-election campaign, ended up with a lower percentage of the popular vote, admittedly in a three-party, than any president, any Republican, any incumbent president since 1912. It was one of the worst debacles in history, and so that's my view of these things.
Well, and then it was that put Newt Gingrich in position to become Speaker, right?
It did.
Had he already defeated Bob Michael at that point?
Michael was still in charge. Michael actually didn't stop becoming leader until 1994, but Gingrich became the whip in '89, I think it was, and became sort of the soul of the Republican Party activist movement after, during that budget fight. It was sort of him keeping the torch of Reaganism, as it were, alive. So I think that, look, if you want, no Democrat is saying that we must raise taxes so that we can cut spending. It's just not the way they're operating. They want to raise taxes to make fewer spending cuts, not more spending cuts. And so I just think the Republicans are getting suckered by this. And I'm delighted to see that Coburn, after 2 or 3 months of flirting like a fool on this thing, has now gone back to realizing that if you want to, again, as I said about the Ryan plan, I've written this many, many times, I don't think the Ryan plan is realistic. I don't think 2/3 Medicare cuts on the existing baseline are plausible. Now, admittedly, it's 2050, it's a long ways away. I don't think these kind of cuts are plausible. This is what both parties need to do, is to figure out, okay, how do you make things cheaper? You know who Eva Moskowitz is?
Yeah.
Okay, right, Eva Moskowitz.
Former New York City Council member.
Right, former Democratic New York City Council member from Manhattan, who sort of woke up one day 10 years ago and said, wow, the schools really stink in New York City. They're spending $15,000, whatever the number is, a year per kid. And so I'm going to start talking about that. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, the teachers' unions got together and crushed her in an election, and now she's running charter schools. And she had an op-ed in the Post Washington Post a couple months ago, in which she said, look, I, Eva Moskowitz, Democrat, am now running 7 charter schools in New York City, and I'm doing them cheaper and better, in part because I am giving a laptop to every kid. The laptop idea, I agree, and when they're $3,000 a piece, you can't really give them to 9-year-olds, but when they're $300 a piece, you can start thinking about it. And iPads and computerized whiteboards and so on. I mean, she's actually increasing class size. She's doing exactly the opposite of what everybody was saying for 3 decades, which is
right. Well, the class size debate is over. It's pretty clear that has no real impact.
Okay, well,
and you got pretty large classes.
I can remember. I don't know about you, Mark. I was born in '58, and I can remember sitting in classes with easily 40 kids in 5th or 6th or 7th grade back then. 40.
Right. My school was small, but probably I'm probably about the same for me.
Yeah, these are public schools in reasonably affluent suburbs of Chicago, in my case. And they cut the class. I think the average class in the country is like 17 now or something. And in fact, what we need is something completely different. And again, that's the kind of debate we need to be having. And it's a getting away from the macros of tax increases versus no tax increases. It's a micro argument. How do you make education better?
Well, no, I mean, I'm totally fine with that, and I think and I'm uncomfortable with the liberal approach of saying schools don't matter that much, and the revolution that is represented by charter schools and the level of innovation in education, some of which people are a little staked out on experiments. You have to admit some things don't really work, and a lot of charter schools aren't as successful as the very best charter schools, and which is why the overall results are not significantly different. But this wave of experimentation in education is definitely something to learn a lot about for other fields. I think that, to me, when I look at where's that coming from in health, it's things like the Dartmouth studies, the whole range of innovations about how you would cut costs, many of which are built into the Affordable Care Act.
Well, the Dartmouth study has been, I think, pretty thoroughly debunked for this. And I realize it's the apple of the Obama administration's eye and so on. But the point is the huge bulges in cost are on places like McAllen, Texas, which is where Atul Gawande of the New Yorker went to get his stuff. And he managed to write an entire article without mentioning illegal immigration. Well, who do you think is using the Medicare and Medicaid system in a town across the Rio Grande River from Mexico? Those don't get factored in because it's not legal, but they do it anyway.
Well, I mean that may or may not be. That didn't seem to be any. It's true he didn't talk about that. I don't think those doctors who were charging boatloads of money were doing it by taking a risk on people who actually aren't eligible for Medicare.
They were who knows what they were doing. The thing is, it's look, here's the rule. I mean, and this is where Gingrich had a point. And again, he said it badly on his right-wing versus left-wing social engineering. Those are just two loaded phrases. The thing is, both what Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act shares in common with the Ryan Plan, and most of these sort of empowerment-oriented Cato heritage-type plans, is the presumption that the person who will, the entity that will control the price, and that is, as in reduce the price, is the payer of healthcare. In the Obama liberal Dartmouth plan, it'll be some wise bureaucrat in Washington or Austin, Texas, or wherever, who will say, "Aha, you're paying too much down there in McAllen, Texas, or Green Bay, Wisconsin, or wherever it might be." And in the Ryan Cato Institute vision, it's the individual who says, "Listen, you're charging me too much," and I think this is both intellectually a wrong way to think about how healthcare costs are controlled, as Kenneth Arrow pointed out back in 1963 in an essay in the American Economic Review, where he said, listen, the information asymmetry between a patient and a doctor is so vast, right, aside from the fact that you might be comatose when you're in the doctor's office, or you might be in extreme distress, or right, in hysterics, or whatever it is, even if you're completely compos mentis, you're still not really going to know what he's talking about. And how could you? Right. And so that the consumer vision of healthcare for anything other than aspirin and Band-Aids and things like that, or LASIK surgery, which is commoditized because of technology. By the way, what makes LASIK surgery cheap is that we have perfected the technology so much that you can go on eBay and get the cheapest plan. Meanwhile, on the other side, it's just a plain fact of political science now that ordinary consumers are not going to accept decisions made by the Independent Payment Advisory Board or a MedFed or all the various names they've come up with. They just won't. That's to the average American, or at least to enough Americans, that's a death panel. And they're not going to accept it.
Well, there are already physician payment. There's the Physician Payment Review Board and whatever it's called now. I mean, it's not a system like that has to be making those choices, and they already are making those choices. I think the thing about the Dartmouth studies and some of the other things is I think you're right that neither just the insurer or Medicare pushing costs down, or the empowered individual negotiating for the price of their long-term care or whatever is going to do it, but changing physician behavior. I mean, that's the lesson of the Atul Gawande story, is that every place has a totally different physician culture in terms of what they order, what they do, what their protocols are. And if you can at least standardize the protocols around the research about what's most effective, you probably can, improve outcomes and reduce costs, right? I mean, that's my amateur understanding of it.
Well, and Gawande, to his credit, wrote another book called The Checklist Manifesto, which is a useful list of trying to establish best practices. And there's a certain amount of utility in there. But again, what you really need then to make it work, so that we're not applying best practices to the 1% of the 1/10 of 1% of the population that's allergic to a certain drug and so on, is personalized medicine, which they don't have. And why don't they have personalized medicine? Why have we been talking, Mark, you and I, and others, for 30 years about digitalizing medical records, which is the key to personalization? Why does it never happen? Because of the trial errors. No hospital, no medical accountable care organization, no physician's office, nobody wants to digitalize medical records and put anything on them of value if they know that John Edwards can come and sue them.
Well, why do some people do? I mean, that seems. I mean, some places obviously do, and over time you do see more and more. The doctor with the tablet computer, and I mean, obviously we're all moving from physician to physician. As relatively healthy grown-ups, we change insurance plans. We need a different physician. I never see a physician for more than 2 years. Before I wind up with a new one, and don't see them very often in that period. So there's no continuity, but within that, it seems to me that every doctor's office I've been to or hospital, I mean, there's an increasing use of that technology.
There is, but they're careful. They're careful what they write down.
It's the discontinuity. It's the discontinuity
without even
in
realizing
our lives.
They're careful what they could record. And what the data aren't really is transferable from doctor to doctor to doctor, because they don't want to make it that way. Right. There's lots of reasons for that. There's lots of reasons, including the fact doctors don't want to lose patients because if they make it too easy to switch records, they need to switch them over and things like that. Right. So there's other factors as well. But the point is that the grand vision, including the sort of, which was a good idea in the Affordable Health Care Act and the stimulus package, they put like 37 billion with a B into health IT. I guarantee most of those machines are never going to get used for anything other than running video games in hospitals, because they're just not going to, until you eliminate the scourge of trial lawyers. And remember, it's not just the fact that they add $100,000 to the bill of every doctor in the country. That's a known fact, and just what it costs for malpractice insurance. It's that they get into the decision loop of, what were you thinking when you did this? And then they can use that to get into product liability and so on. And as long as that's there, the digitalization of medical records and all the benefits that would come, Mark, from you and I having a little tricorder, and the doctor too. So the doctor points a tricorder at us, and the data from every patient with a similar situation in the world is put into some algorithm that says you need this, this, and this. But then you've got the same tricorder, you the patient. And you say, well, look, I'm looking at the same information.
A tricorder, are you talking about like a Star Trek thing?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I mean, as in, this is what we would want. We would want a computer. What we all want is, and what Gawande is on to something about the checklist. But you want the doctor to have the checklist. You want the same checklist.
Right.
You might have such faith in the doctor. You say, "Look, I trust you. You just go ahead and do what you want to do." But if you're at all curious or concerned or skeptical or want a second opinion or anything like that, or just want to go through it, assuming you're not in an emergency situation, you say, "Listen, let's just walk through this list of things. Tell me why I can't have a generic drug. Tell me why I can't just have outpatient surgery. Tell me that there's all these cases of breast biopsies where." And you can do it with a needle, or you can do it with surgery, and not surprisingly, the surgery is a lot more expensive.
Right.
But doctors make an argument. Look, you need the surgery part, not the needle part, for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Right.
This is how you get an empowered patient, but this will never happen so long as it becomes the digitalization turns. That John Edwards could sit there in his lawyer's office and just F2 for chest pains and build a 1 million-person class action suit.
I don't understand why. I'm not sure I understand why. And maybe there's an article we can link to or something like that. I'm not dismissing this out of hand, but I don't really understand why a trial lawyer is a trial lawyer better off if he has access to all those records as opposed to being able to depose the doctor and say what were you thinking, and depose the nurse and say what were you thinking, and actually reveal the sort of sloppiness of their diagnosis as opposed to actually having a computer record that says here's what we did, here's what the protocol. If you followed all the protocols for that condition, presumably you should be in pretty good shape.
Well, remember, in product liability, you can follow all the protocols, you still get sued. The FDA approves a drug, the FDA approves Vioxx, the FDA approves, Fen, whatever it is, and then it starts to hurt people, and the FDA they get sued anyway. So in other words, following all the protocols is no defense whatsoever against the product.
Right, but I'm talking about right, but product. I mean, once a product's on the doctors aren't on the line for product liability.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to the doctors. Now the doctor says, "Listen, you're John Edwards, and to build your case, you have to depose the doctor and the nurse, and they might not tell you the truth. Mm-hmm. But if suppose they did tell the truth to a digital record." I told the patient not to worry about that chest pain. I mean, again, there's a reason why doctors only record about 1% of the information every patient has. 1%, because they don't. Part of it, they don't have time. There's no technically good way to do it, and they really don't want to hear in a strange way about all the problems that might get them sued. But if all that were instantly available, on hit one button and you've instantly got your case, then believe me, there'll be nothing but lawsuits in the medical system.
Right. Now, all of that is
the Obama administration has not bothered to address in any meaningful way. And frankly, the Republicans haven't pressed them on it.
Right. No, of course not. Right. I mean, they pressed on the liability reform, not linking it to the electronic medical records. And this is the first conversation I've ever really heard about that. I mean, but our old colleague Phil Longman wrote a book about the VA system, and the VA system, among its advantages, because it has the total continuity, they do have the breakthrough in medical IT. And they're not invulnerable to trial lawyers, right? I mean, you can sue the VA, right?
Yeah, you can. I mean, Phil's book is good. So we should link to Phil Longman's book, Best Care Anywhere, about the VA. And we should also, I'll mention him on the air, as it were, a guy named Jim Wooten, Wootto, and not to be confused with the former ABC lawyer who's written a lot about this. And then the viewers can sort those issues out. But I just point out to you, have an anecdotal conversation with anybody who runs a hospital and tell you they're not at all keen about making all their digital records transparent.
Okay.
That's all. And if they're not transparent to the doctors and the hospitals, and they're not transparent to the patient, and they're sure as heck not transparent if you were to transport yourself from Washington D.C. to Washington State, you'd have to start all over again. And if the doctor forgot to write down some important piece of medical information about you and your family, well, that could be a grave risk.
Okay. All right. I mean, you're more involved in this than I am. It's an interesting. I'll look at some of the. It's interesting to think of. I've never really heard trial lawyers raised as such a large part of the obstacle to digital medical records.
Well, so, think about back to industrial process. Think about how processes get better in American factories, such as there are any factories left in this country. They get better through all this sort of Dr. Deming quality circle stuff, right? And the basic idea is at the end of the production run, that day or that week or whatever it might be, the workers and the foremen and whoever else get together and say, now, how did it go today? How did it go this week? How did our production run go this week? Now, in the sort of spirit of, team building and all this good stuff, okay, now, Tom, Dick, Harry, Susie, whoever, tell us what you did, how did it go, what did you see, what did you learn, and things like that. And if the system is working properly, the worker raises his or her hand and says, well, I'm not sure this really went well. I think I could have done better on that. I think I might have let a crack and something go by. And everybody kind of claps and sings a song and does the company calisthenics. And they result. And
Could you work in that environment? Could you work in that kind of environment?
and then they record it, and they put it in a database. And it all spits itself out the next week and the next Monday, and they start all over again and do it better.
Right. But a lot of that, again, I mean, the culture of doctors, which is, which is a standard of saying, I'm a professional, I'm not an employee. They I have my practice, I'm an employee, I have my patients. To be part of some quality circle, some factory, that's not why I became a doctor. So there's a culture of medicine that makes that kind of thing difficult to realize.
You're right. And there's a further culture of fear of nobody. If you're presiding over a batch of cracked teapots that wind up, on a shelf in a Walmart in Oklahoma, you're not really in any legal trouble. But if you are presiding over somebody who's not looks a little green, and when he got through with his operation, and you don't say anything about it, you're in a huge amount of trouble. And if the person dies, and and you don't record it anywhere that you had a concern about this, you're off the hook on the malpractice or the liability.
Okay,
and
maybe.
And it's a little cruel to say it this way, but ethics require one thing: full disclosure, total honesty, total everything. Science and mass production require a willingness to look to the greater good of getting it done, and that requires a constant feedback. And you can't have people getting in trouble when they do the right thing, because they won't do it for very long.
Okay, all right. Let's move on from this point. Do you want to take a minute? You suggested talking about Obama's Middle East speech tomorrow, or do you want to wrap up?
I think you take.
I don't have a lot to say about it.
Okay, I'll take a minute. I mean, and just say I find it interesting, and I'll just leave it at that. That apparently on Thursday, President Obama is going to call for a new round of Middle East peace talks, returning Israel returning ultimately to the 67 borders, and sharing Jerusalem as his capital. I really, don't see this happening, and I'm sort of puzzled as a student of bureaucracies and so on. I can sort of see how the idea of another round of Middle East peace talks, even after George Mitchell just quit, is sort of what the State Department and the National Security Council and whoever else kind of do. And sort of they build a lifetime of doing this. But it certainly strikes me as kind of a implausible, not to mention impolitic mission.
Okay. I mean, I think that obviously the big innovation of this administration has been consistently saying that Middle East peace is in the U.S. interest, and and not. Obama has repeated, the old aphorism, "We can't care about it more than the parties do," has been reduced in importance. I mean, we do care about it more, and I think making clear that with a changing Middle East, you have some different opportunities and some different players than the same old, Mubarak providing this guarantee for Israel, I think potentially changes things a little bit. So I think reasserting that is important. Obviously, it doesn't. You can also say yes that under given current conditions and given Netanyahu's intransigence, it can't happen right now. But by the same token, a lot of the domestic policies we've been talking about can't happen right now or can't be put through the political process as we know it. But that doesn't mean you don't talk about them and affirm them.
Well, I guess I just see so little yield potentially here, and meanwhile, other events like the next Gaza flotilla is going to leave Turkey reportedly sometime in mid-June. That'll be another international incident. You can just sort of put money on it. And then, the UN General Assembly is going to vote in September, possibly to, recognize a Palestinian state within the territorial ambit of Israel plus the territories and so on. You would think that the Obama administration, having completely struck out on this issue, and having gone through George Mitchell, who was a well-meaning guy who put 2 years into this, thinking that just as he said when he took the job on the Northern Ireland peace stuff, I had 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. This time he had 701 days of failure and then quit. I just as an observer find it sort of puzzling that they would think this is given how far apart the parties are, Fatah having signed up again with Hamas, and Netanyahu obviously not interested. What the briefing to the president is on, probably along the lines that you said, earlier, Mark, that is, look, we're now at the point where we got so much going on that we got to do something, and so even though it's not going to succeed, we're going to do it. We're going to try, just to get credit with the quartet at the UN or something. Again, as a little subset of futile policies that never seem to go away because they just have their own sort of bureaucratic momentum, I put this effort in that category.
Well, maybe. I think that it's great to see the administration kind of stick with something and not fall back on what's politically realizable at the moment. And granted, it's in a sense it's easier to do that with something else, something like this. I think that obviously, the Hamas-Fatah alignment was brokered in part by Egypt, which is a very significant statement that despite everything that's going on in the transition there, that they're still going to be, that they're engaged at that level. I think that's something that Israel has to kind of notice. And I think that as a flotilla, if there's another blockade of a flotilla to Gaza, it's one more thing that really, the politics about Israel in the U.S. have really, really changed. And, as Peter Beinart and others have pointed out, younger Jews, and, I'm half Jewish, I don't strongly identify with Israel, but my views are similar to those of a lot of people of my generation and younger who just don't, we don't understand the intransigence, and that's important to Israel. Obviously, the Israeli political elite knows that, and the support of American Jews is hugely important to them, and it's slipping away from them. So those kinds of developments, I think, do create not necessarily immediate opportunities, but long-term opportunities that you can only realize if you just stick with it, and be willing to keep reasserting the same point over and over again.
Yeah, no, I think Peter Beinart wrote that, if I recall, in the New York Review of Books. We should link to that. That was an interesting article, and we're kind of running out of time here, so we could just simply say, look, if you want to read that, do so. So I guess we both did. Recommend
two books and a long article, and have a well-educated blogging heads readership.
Well, that's they already were long before they met us.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right, Mark. It was fun.
Okay.
Thank
Good
you.
to talk to you, Jim.
Watching.
Take care.
See you again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.